Hello and welcome to this mini-series on Linux Essentials. In this video series, I'll be providing you with some inside knowledge on the top things you should really know when using the Linux CLI. Now, this video series is coming to you from the Raspberry Pi coding channel. However, the content for this mini-series is not for Raspberry Pi specifically, it's for general Linux CLI usage, and I'm not targeting any particular distribution for the majority of the series. I will, of course, naturally be demonstrating the Linux CLI features on my Raspberry Pi 4 in accordance with my channel objective, but you don't have to have a Raspberry Pi to follow along. In this video series then, I'll be showing you what I personally think are the most important things to know about the Linux CLI, with minimum additional clutter and noise. I'm just focusing on the core things that I personally use every day or find really useful. For context, I've been using Linux almost daily for about 6 years, and I've been using Linux on and off for about 10 years. Part of my current job is in fact administration for a number of Linux machines. Something I should point out before we go on as well is that I am creating this course to complement my existing video series on how to host a website and email server on your home Raspberry Pi with the traffic passing through your home router. So if you're interested in creating a home hosting solution and you have a Raspberry Pi, you have a website you want to host and you'd like to have an email account associated with it, my video series will cover you on all of those aspects. So please do check them out on my channel. Okay, so here is the full list of things I'll be covering in this mini series. Don't worry, each of these in itself isn't particularly difficult and each video will be nice and short and cover multiple topics. I'll be explaining for each one what situations I find the feature useful for, why it's worth knowing, and I'll give examples as well. Now, very briefly, before I go on, I just want to raise to your attention my Patreon account. The reason is that I release videos based on subscriber levels. So as I get more subscribers, I release videos at certain thresholds. The videos are first, however, made available to my patrons via Patreon. So if you'd like to see videos later in the series than are available, then check out my Patreon account. If you'd like one-to-one support with me because you're stuck or want to ask a question about Linux, would like to suggest content for the course, or if you would just like to support my work, please do visit the Patreon account. Okay, so let's get going. A few points I want to raise before we start. I'll be using a Raspberry Pi 4, but you can use any Linux system to follow along. You don't have to have done any of my previous video series to follow this video series. In fact, I would recommend you did this video series first. In each video, I'll be starting from the command prompt or shell or console, whatever your preferred vernacular is for it. But basically, I'll always be starting from that point. So I'm assuming you can get to that point. In this particular video, I won't be ticking off any points on the list I've shown. I'll be showing instead the very basics of Linux CLI, such as how to navigate the command line, where your home directory is, how to navigate your home directory, how to get around basically more quickly. It's going to be a very short little tutorial as this is just the introductory video. And the last thing I'll mention is I use SSH aliases. So if you're connecting to your Linux machine remotely as opposed to directly, so I'm talking about a headless system, then you'll be SSHing in. If you do SSH into your Linux infrastructure, you absolutely, in my opinion, should be using an SSH alias. It'll make your life a lot easier for the entire duration in which you'll be connecting to that server. It allows you just to type in 2 words typically and you're in. It means you'll also have to set up some public-private keys, but it's worth the effort. Now, if you don't use SSH aliases, but you do use SSH, I strongly recommend looking at the first 2 videos in my website hosting video series on my channel. They are specifically focused on setting up your Raspberry Pi to be secure by disabling username and password authentication, and how to set up a public-private key pair, and then how to set up an SSH alias. So follow the first few videos of my course and you'll be set up and ready to go if that's how you're going to do things. Okay, let's then head over to my desktop and I will give you the very basics of the Linux CLI. Okay, so here we are on my desktop. I tend to use Windows as my desktop, so I use PowerShell typically to SSH into Linux environments and Linux machines. In this case, I've SSH'd into my Raspberry Pi 4. It's worth noting that I've SSH'd into my Pi already, So I'm already in the shell on the Pi here, as you can see on the screen, and I've done so using an SSH alias. And in this video, you'll see an advantage of using an SSH alias because we'll have to hop in and out of the shell a couple of times, and you'll see just how quick it is if we're using an alias. Okay, so first question then. Here we are in a so-called terminal or shell, but what is a shell? Well, the shell, which is what we're going to interact with here, is basically an interface between the human user and the Linux kernel, where the kernel is responsible for doing low-level operations, like interacting with hardware, like, for example, I don't know, graphics card, sound card, that sort of thing, doing file input and output operations, and creating new processes. So the shell is a command line interpreter. It allows you to interact with the kernel by passing it human-readable commands. Now, it's very important to know there are different variants of shells, not just one. Often, when you log in, you're going to log in to the bash shell, but not always, and it depends what you're using. If you're using a Raspberry Pi 4, for example, with Raspbian, as I am here, you'll be logging in to a bash terminal. Okay, so you can find out what variant of shell you're using with the following command. This is the first useful thing to know in the Linux CLI. Type as I type, it's quite simple. PS, so we're going to look at a process here, but I'll get into more detail of what things like PS are in later videos. Minus P, and then $2. So PS minus P and $2. Let's see what happens. Okay, so the important point to gain out of this line is that it says bash just here. So we are indeed using the bash terminal. Now, people who use Linux regularly could tell you just by looking at this that we're using bash. But this is a good way to check. Now, bash is the default shell for modern Debian. And unless you're a rather peculiar purist, bash is, without doubt, a better and superior shell to work with compared to the original Bourne shell, which is represented simply as sh. So the Bourne shell, which you might see sometimes, is just sh like that. So it goes without saying that for the remainder of this course, I'll be using a bash shell. So here is your first useful fact to take away from this course. There are other shells in Linux, and it won't always be the case that a new system you use is using bash, though it probably will be. I've already given you a handy tip for how to find out what shell you're using, but what if you want to use bash, but you are currently by default logged in to the classic Bourne shell, for example? Well, if the system you are using doesn't have bash installed, you'll need to install it, but we won't go there now. We'll just assume that bash is installed for the time being, as it often is. So, this is how you change between shell variants. Let's switch from bash to the classic Bourne shell as follows. So type what I type. CHSH for change shell, minus S, and then we're going to type a path in, /bin/sh. If you do that and press enter, it'll ask you for your password. Type your password in, and it's done. So you'll see that we're using the command to change shell, chsh, and the path it is pointing to is bin/sh. The bin directory, that you can see the first part of the path here, is the binary folder on a Linux system, within which the executable Bourne shell exists, sh. A binary is another word for an executable, so it isn't hard to suss out what must exist within the bin folder in general. If you want to find out which shells are available, you can have a nosy around the bin directory, and we're going to do that later in this video. Okay, so nothing appears to have happened with having used that command, but that's because we're currently still in a bash shell. We need to log out now or open a new terminal to see the effect. So I'll log out and log back in again. I do this by typing exit, back out into my PowerShell terminal, and now I'm going to use my SSH alias, which is Pi4, to log back in to the Raspberry Pi. Okay, so as you can see, things appear a bit different. Straight away you can see that the shell looks a little different. To start with the current terminal or current shell, we have nothing here but a $sign telling us it's ready to receive a command. Yet with the bash shell up here, we've got the path, which I'll explain a little later, we've got the username, and we've got the machine name. So there's a lot more information, and I can also tell you, though we haven't covered it yet, that bash has a lot more functionality that the original Bourne shell doesn't have, which we'll again explore a little bit later. Anyway, as we're working in bash for this series, let's undo this process and get back from the Bourne shell to the bash shell. We'll do that by using the same command we used previously and pointing it to the bash binary instead. So do as I do, chsh for change shell, -s, which is a flag. So anything where you've got a single character and before that is a hyphen or a minus character, that's called a flag or an option. Depends where you're from and how you prefer to say it, but that's what it is. And it means it's an option which you can add to the end of a command. In this case, change shell is the utility, the command that we're running, and we can pass an option to it. And the option is basically the path to the shell in this case. Now, how you know that is another thing for another time. But for now, you can just take it by rote. Just remember, if you want to change the shell, it's chsh -s for the option or flag, followed by the path. So in this case, I'm going to do /bin to go into the binary directory, which we've discussed is the directory where the executables exist for the shell or for the terminal. And I'm going to tell it to point to bash instead. As before, I need to type in my password, which I'll do. And as before, nothing has happened. So I'm going to exit out, and I'm then going to connect again using my SSH alias pi to get back to where we were. Okay, I'm now going to clear my screen because it's getting a little bit cluttered. Okay, so that's great. You know roughly what a shell is now. You know there are multiple shells. You know how to find out what shell you're currently using, and you know how to switch between shells. So let's now learn a few of the very basic things we can do with the bash shell. Well, firstly, when we first log into our Linux system, or when we open a new terminal, if you're using a desktop Linux system, we start by default in our user's home directory. Our user's home directory is there as a personal space. It is only you, and the system admin of course, who can create, delete and modify files in here. There are exceptions to that if you give people permissions to do it, but typically that's the case. So it's a great place for documents, repositories and code which are yours and yours only. Now you can see there is nothing currently obvious telling us that we're in our home directory. Well, actually there is something. Your home directory is such a common place to go to that Linux defines its path by the tilde character, which you can see here. So this is telling us that we're in our user's home directory currently. Now we can confirm this explicitly by using the pwd command, which stands for present working directory. Let's try that out. Let's type in pwd, press enter, and it'll now show us the full path where we're sitting. As you can see, it's in our user pi's home directory. Now all users have their own directories in the home directory at the root of the Linux file system. You can see here the home directory, and you can see user pi has their own home directory within it. So the root of the file system is the highest point you can go to and is represented by the first / at the beginning of the path here. So you can see we are at root, then we're at home, and then we're at pi. That's our current path. Okay, so let's now move to a new folder. Now I happen to have a folder called website within my home directory. You might not have it. I created it as part of my video series on hosting a website and email server on a Raspberry Pi. So what I'll do just quickly is I'll move into that folder so that it becomes my present working directory as follows, using the change directory command. So cd, most people will already be aware of this change directory command, and I'll type in website just because I happen to know that this directory exists. Now for you, you may not have this directory. If you don't, you'll get a warning saying there's no such file or directory. That's okay. That's really useful information after all. We can go up and down to our heart's content. To go backwards, or up, we just use 2 period characters after the change directory command as follows: cd, space, and then 2 periods as follows. And that'll take us up 1 level. We're now back where we started, just with the tilde character and therefore in our user's home directory. Again, we can confirm that by typing pwd. So let's do that again. Let's go up another directory into the actual home directory itself. There we go. Now you can see because we've gone up beyond our home directory, we no longer have a tilde, but instead we just have /home as our path. So that's telling us we're at root and then inside the home directory above root. So now let's go up one more time and go to the root of the file system. Now we can't go any further back at this point. We're at the root. If we type in cd ... nothing happens because we've got nowhere else left to go. Right, enough for going backwards and forwards. Let's now find out how we can see what's in our present working directory. We can do this using another very familiar command that many people will already be aware of, and that's the ls command as follows. ls will list the file system for us and show us what is in this current directory. So as you can see, there are plenty of directories at the root of our file system. And if we look carefully, we'll see one called bin. As you know, that's bin for binary. We've already talked about that, and that's what we used, or that's what we pointed to when we changed our shell. So here's another really important thing to know about Linux, another nugget of useful information to stick in your notes. Many, though not all, of the commands that you can run at the command line in a shell are located in the bin directory. So let's have a look inside and see what's in there. Let's go cd to change directory and go into the bin directory. Now I'm going to use ls to see what's inside. There we go. Okay. So in the binary folder or bin folder at the root of your file system, this is where the shell finds various executable utilities. For example, we can see if you look closely the mv binary or move. This is to move files or directories. This is a fantastic utility that you're going to be using regularly in your career with Linux. There's also the ls utility for listing directories, which we're already using. If you look closely, you'll find that. There's also bash and sh, which are the 2 shells that we've used already. We can also see nano, and that's a text editor that I use regularly at the command line. We can see pwd that we've been using, which is present working directory. We can also see superuser, which is su just here, etc., etc. So this is where they all live. If you wonder where many of the commands that you run actually come from, where the actual executable comes from, it's here in the binary folder. A very useful thing to know. Now, how does Linux know where to look for these binary executables is something called the path, and we'll cover that later on. But for now, before we wrap up, let's just take a look at how we create and delete a file or directory. So I'm going to clear my screen to make things organized. So first, let's move back to our home directory, where we know we have permissions to create files and directories. Let's do that with the change directory or cd command or utility, as we've used before, but we'll use the tilde expression to go directly there. So if I do cd tilde, I can then go straight to my home directory, and you can see the home directory represented by the tilde just here. Of course, we could have done the following, and it would have taken us to the same place. And if I press enter, we don't appear to go anywhere. That's because that is the same directory as a tilde for the user pi. Okay, so to create a directory, we use the make directory utility mkdir as follows. So let's give it a go. Follow along with me, mkdir demo directory, for example, where I'm using camel case for the name of the directory. Press enter, and we've created the directory. So let's go into it. So cd demo directory, press enter. Oops, try to type it correctly, as I was unable to. Let's now see what's inside this directory by typing in ls to list the contents. As expected, it's empty and we see nothing. Let's now create a new file. We do that in many ways, but the purest way is to use the touch command. So I'll type in touch and then I'll give it a name, my new file. So this should create a file called my new file within the demo directory. Okay, great. Let's now see what's inside the directory now. There we go, my new file is where we expect it to be. That's great. Now a file which is empty isn't much use, and we'll talk about how to quickly view and edit files later in this course, but for now we'll just accept that the file is created and in theory we could do something with it. Right, let's clean up before we finish this video. Let's leave our directory first by typing in cd and then ... as we've shown before. This will take us up one directory and out of the demo directory. Okay, now let's delete what we've done by deleting the directory and all of its content. Deleting content on Linux is done as follows. rm for remove, followed by what you want to delete. In this case, I want to delete an entire directory. So I'm going to type in demo directory. And then if I press enter now, it won't work. And I'll show you what it'll say. It'll say cannot remove demo directory because basically it's a directory. Now that makes perfect sense because the remove command or utility is trying to delete just one entity. But that one entity happens to be a directory which contains other entities. So it's saying, well, you can't do that. So to force it to do that, you use a -r flag or option at the end. And what that is saying is to delete things recursively. So we're saying it's okay to delete demo directory and everything inside of it. Okay, so we press enter. So that's quite a risky thing to do because it'll mean that no matter what's inside your directory, you've just deleted it and it's gone. But it is the way to delete a directory. You're basically using the same utility you would to delete a file. If I wanted to delete a file, I'd basically type in rm my file and it would delete a file. But you're adding a -r because it's a directory, you need to delete things recursively to go through that directory structure and delete everything that's inside. Okay, so what we've covered so far isn't groundbreaking, it's pretty standard stuff. But something to take away here, aside from the commands I've just been through, is to be careful with the rm command. Unlike Windows and indeed GUI-driven versions of Linux, the shell doesn't natively have the concept of a recycling bin or trash can. Once you've deleted an item, it's gone for good. There are ways to retrieve a deleted item if it's really important, but it's not a convenient thing to do. So this shouldn't be a scary thing using rm because eventually it'll instill in you the think twice, type once approach to working at the command line, which is really important anyway for many reasons. Because working at the command line is generally a very powerful thing to do, you do have to be quite careful. If you're desperate for a recycling bin style backup solution, you can install a third-party utility called trash, and there are others, and then use the trash utility or command to delete files instead of rm. But I suggest you don't. It's much more common to adopt a careful attitude and use rm to properly delete your files, in my opinion. Okay, that's it. We've finished this basic introduction to the Linux shell. A lot of it is fairly straightforward, but hopefully amongst the straightforward content, you've found some nuggets of new information, and I think you'll find there's many more to come in the rest of this series. If you found this video useful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like the video. It doesn't cost you anything to do it, and if you could please subscribe to my video series if you're going to think about following the whole series. It's the best metric I have for people finding this useful, so I appreciate a subscription very much. Also, if you'd like to see the videos before they're released, if you'd like to get one-to-one support with me, or if you'd just like to support my work, I'd very much appreciate it, and for that you can see my Patreon account. Okay, that's it, and I will see you in the next video.